So one of the big difficulties in legal history and in trying to reconstruct the history of legal practice all across Europe in the Central Middle Ages is the diversity of case material and the records recording legal practice. They come in many different types of genre, they have different provenances, different types of authorship and structure of these sources. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the sources are like for, say, the royal courts in England or the ecclesiastical courts.
Well, as for England, the records of the royal courts begin to survive at the very end of the 12th century. So before that, we're left searching through charters or even narrative sources such as hagiographies or chronicles for incidental details of legal proceedings. But in 1194, we have the first surviving plea rolls made for royal justices in the royal courts. It's possible that plea rolls were made in earlier decades. There's certainly someone certainly thinks they were, because there's a request in the earlier 13th century that the records, the rolls of Henry II's reign, should be searched for details of a case. Whether this was a misconception or not, we don't know, but we do know that from 1194 onwards we have the plea rolls of the royal courts. The following year, records of fines, compromises made in the royal courts, begin to survive as well. They're called the feet of the fines because they are the foot, so the bottom part of the tripartite chirograph made to record the terms of the settlement. And these form a almost continuous series of records from that date onwards, which provide a very useful, I'd say comprehensive. They're comprehensive in the sense that they record certain key details of the case, but they are very terse, and they often omit details that the legal historian really wants to find out about. And then later in the 13th century we have the yearbooks, which are records made in French, informal records made in French, purportedly of the actual words that were spoken in court. They were made by lawyers for lawyers for the purpose of legal education.
In the ecclesiastical courts, we have kind of a similar timeline as well. So prior to around 1193, there are narrative sources and some bishops' registers and a bit of correspondence. But 1193 is when we start to first see what we would consider maybe formal court records containing the activities of the court on a specific day and so on. And this is the format that we get carrying through the 13th century. We still have bishops' registers, but the actual proceedings of the court are recorded separately, along with any documents that pertain to a particular case. So the depositions of witnesses, the claims of the parties, things like that. And we actually know from the records that the court has were also copied and distributed to the parties. So presumably there were private collections as well, but I don't think we have any of those kicking around.
It's interesting because I know in terms of chronology, France is similar, if a bit later. So royal records in France don't start, for example, until the 1250s with the Parlement records, which are known as les Olines. And we start to get seigneurial records of actual court records not until the late 13th century, but really the early 14th century. And it's quite difficult because I think for all of our respective areas, we are trying to look at a period of legal formation when we don't actually have court records per se. So within much of France, for example, in the 11th and 12th centuries, and one of the real kind of formative periods of legal history, all we have are charters or these narratives like in chronicles or hagiography. And charters, for example, are written usually by one of the parties to a dispute and are very difficult to interpret for that reason. And it's not until later that we get courts written from the perspective of the court. And I think these are one of the big challenges.